Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists and nature experts from New England and around the world. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. I'm your host, Liz Alverson. Today, we're going to be talking about NatureVest, TNC's impact investing team, which is helping to transform the way we protect nature. Working with conservation collaborators from around the world, the NatureVest team sources, structures, and closes impact investments that support TNC's mission. Tom Hodgman, Deputy Managing Director of Forest Investing, and Andrew Tingley, Director of Communications for NatureVest, will share how NatureVest is safeguarding biodiversity in the face of climate change across 253,000 acres of central Appalachian forests. They'll also talk about how upfront philanthropy is helping TNC provide debt relief for island nations to potentially unlock $1.6 billion for ocean conservation. After their presentation, Tom and Andrew will take your questions live. But first, a little more about Andrew and Tom. Andrew Tingley is the Director of Communications for NatureVest. Based in New York, Andrew leads communications and marketing activities for NatureVest. He's focused on engaging with conservation partners, investors, and the financial community at large. In previous roles, Andrew has led private equity investor relations, marketing, executive communications, and public relations efforts. Andrew holds a BA from the University of Connecticut. And Tom Hodgman is the Deputy Managing Director of Forest Investing with NatureVest. Tom manages the Nature Conservancy's impact investment work in forest conservation, working forests, and forest carbon markets. He also has an MBA and Master's in Forestry from Yale. Before I hand it over to Andrew and Tom, a few quick webinar notes. Their presentation will run for about 25 minutes, and then we'll take your questions live. So please share your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems during the presentation, please let us know in the chat box, and our team will reach out to assist you. For the best view of the presentation, you can go to the pull-down menu at the top center of your screen and choose Fit to Window. Thanks again so much for joining today. Take it away, Andrew.
Thanks, Liz. Great to join you today. And we've heard that this series is pretty popular, so we're excited that you would like to have us here to speak about our work today. And thank you to everybody tuning in. I first thought I'd offer a little bit of background and the nickel tour of the NatureVest team and portfolio before I hand it over to Tom to talk more in depth about some really inspiring work that he does in forestry. Before we begin, though, it'd be good to start by pointing out a couple things. First, some of you on this call are surely familiar with finance or private investment. Some of you may not be, so we'll do our best to cater to both sides. We'll try to limit jargon. We'll try to define it when we do use it, so bear with us. And please know that we want to answer questions whether you're familiar or not at the end. Also, I'm duty bound to point out that neither NatureVest nor TNC is a registered investment advisor. We're also not a broker-dealer. And basically what that means is that our investments have only been open to accredited investors, and we do not solicit investments from the general public. To underscore the importance there, we are not soliciting investments in today's discussion. And so you're aware, there may be certain questions that you have that we're unable to answer since we do need to comply with US securities laws, but do feel free to ask anything and we'll just point out if we get anywhere off limits. So legal disclaimer aside, let's get to it. If you think back in history, TNC has always been a deal-oriented organization. Historically, it was about making relationships and working with stakeholders and funders to put together the purchase of valuable lands that needed protection, which of course is something we still do, among a whole lot of other things, of course. In Massachusetts, you see this in projects like the Coles Brook Preserve, which is pictured here. This is about 1,400 acres that TNC has put together across 16 land parcels so far and continues to build. Over time, TNC pursued more innovative and sophisticated financing to achieve conservation, such as the concept of conservation easements, for example, or even our work buying countries' sovereign debt in Latin America in exchange for conservation commitments from those governments. Toward the end of the 2000s, just after the financial crisis, impact investing was a quickly emerging field. And TNC was convinced that private capital, different than philanthropic or government dollars, private capital would become an essential part of the solution to the toughest challenges that nature faces. And the basic math shows that the scale of the planet's challenges go far beyond what governments can fund and what philanthropists can support. In orders of magnitude, if we're going to secure a sustainable future, conservation needs many times more funding than it currently gets. But that same amount of funding would only represent a tiny slice of the investment dollars that are out there. So private capital can open up a new scale of possibilities that build upon, and certainly do not replace, the crucial work that philanthropy and grants already fund. So TNC formally launched NatureVest in 2014 with support from the Robertson Foundation, the Grantham Environmental Trust based out of Boston, and JP Morgan Chase. And the idea behind that, NatureVest's core purpose, is to connect TNC's scientific expertise and conservation know-how with new business models that are investable, or as we say in finance circles, they meet competitive risk-adjusted financial return expectations. But to boil it down, our role is to show that conservation is possible alongside profits. In part, that's because as a nonprofit, the deals we develop must deliver on TNC's conservation mission. Going further though, we think that if we can show clear and significant outcomes, it can fundamentally transform how capital is invested and how nature itself is valued. That might be an audacious vision. It requires us to be opportunistic. It requires us to be flexible in sectors, across geographies, in the deal structures that we use or the sources of funding we go to. So we have grown the NatureVest unit into what some call a deal shop. And what I mean by that is that we have teammates who work with other TNC teams and third-party partners in some cases to source opportunities, to build these business models, to structure and negotiate partnerships, to fundraise for these investments, and most importantly, to manage the conservation and financial performance of those investments once they're closed. I get to work with some extremely skilled and creative folks, and they've been able to tackle a huge range of conservation challenges in this way. Generally, to meet the dual goals of conservation and returns, you can think of 4 common strategies. They're not the only ones, but 4 typical strategies that TNC and NatureVest often use, either on their own or some combination. Number 1 is managing assets sustainably, whether that's forests or freshwater. The second one is generating revenue streams that pay for conservation or mitigation or restoration. And that shows up in things like financing that helps fund ocean protection. The third might be demonstrating the viability of new markets for nature-based solutions. You see this in fisheries or agriculture. And then the fourth is when TNC can provide the scientific input for our external partners on the environmental impacts and, more importantly, the conservation opportunities that some of the investments have. So taking those strategies and 6 years and $1.3 billion of committed capital, we can point to all the possibilities this team has helped uncover. We have 11 deals, and yes, some are in more than one place, and it's quite a broad range. So we start with forestry in the Pacific Northwest and the Central Appalachians of the US. Tom will talk a lot about this. Freshwater and agriculture deals across 4 continents. For example, in Australia, investing in water markets, where we can literally pump surplus water into wetlands that have been cut off by levee systems. Or in California, we look for ways that commercial agriculture properties could improve habitat for migratory birds. Moving to green infrastructure and renewables, we have a joint venture in Maryland that designs and operates stormwater management systems. And here in Massachusetts, although it's not an impact investment yet, we have provided accelerator funding for colleagues here to evaluate nature-based solutions, working on wastewater management on the Cape. And then finally, in ocean protection and fisheries, it could range from a targeted pilot loan program we have in Alaska to support sustainable practices by community fishers. And we hope that can influence bigger industry players. Or on the other end of the spectrum, our huge Blue Bonds program, in which we want to transform $40 million in philanthropy that we have received to ultimately create $1.6 billion for island and coastal nations to fund ocean conservation. And what you may notice as I go through all that is it sounds like a mix of conservation strategies or investment sectors or business models. You know, we have operating companies over here and investment partnerships over there. We get funding from private equity investors, commercial debt from banks, concessionary financing from foundations. And I'll tell you, I have to admit, as the communications director here, I have yet to find a way to neatly slice and dice all of these primary and secondary attributes into some perfect, tidy diagram. But while they do sound very diverse, and I've covered a lot of ground, I can sum it up with two things that they all have in common. At the ground level, each individual deal seeks to achieve a specific set of conservation outcomes while providing those competitive risk-adjusted financial returns. Then, rolling those all the way to the top, conservation targets across all of these deals are in service of TNC's focus on healthy lands, oceans and freshwater, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. By making that connection, we think this is a really powerful way to apply TNC's science and execution capacity to help reach the scale that can change our course away from that bleak future of biodiversity loss, food and water scarcity, pollution and climate impacts, and toward one in which nature and people really do thrive together instead. So for some examples of how we actually do that, I should turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks to everyone for joining today. Really excited to be with you and share a little bit about the Cumberland Forest Project, one of our most recent impact investments in the forestry space. I'll provide an overview of the project and then we'll get into some questions. What you're looking at here is a view of the Cumberland Plateau, where the Ataya property, which is part of the Cumberland Forest Project, is located. It's a landscape of dense forests and rugged mountains, a place that has faced many threats from extractive industries over time, and also a place that TNC has known as important for a long time. And that is really what the Cumberland Forest Project is all about, taking TNC's accumulated experience and knowledge in identifying and managing landscapes like this, and taking it to scale, helping to scale up our work. And speaking of experience, this first map is so old that you can see the TNC oak leaf logo on it is about 3 iterations ago. But this is a map that's probably familiar to a lot of folks that are familiar with TNC's work. And what it shows is some of the foundational work that TNC and partners did through natural heritage programs. And it shows biodiversity hotspots throughout the United States. You can see on the map that the Central Appalachians, right where Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia come together, is one of the largest biodiversity hotspots in the eastern United States and the entire country. As a result of that, we've had a long history in the region, going back 30 years. This is like the Clinch Valley, where we started working on. I'm seeing that my voice is breaking up.
You sound okay now, but it was sounding a little fuzzy for a brief moment. I think if that continues, we'll just take a break and have you call in maybe, but it sounds okay now. So why don't we continue on?
Okay. Yeah, please let me know, Liz, if there's a problem with the sound.
Will do.
Yeah, so we've had a long history in this region because of some of this foundational work in places like the Clinch Valley, where we started working on freshwater mussels and aquatic biodiversity in the Clinch River about 30 years ago. And pretty soon TNC realized that to conserve the biodiversity in the Clinch River, they had to work on the land as well. The farms and the forests and mining operations, we're talking about the heart of coal country here, have a big impact on what goes on in the river. And in 2002, before impact investing was a word, TNC's Virginia chapter launched the Clear Valley Conservation Forestry Program. It initiated some of the first forest carbon projects under California's emerging cap and trade program. And we built up experience managing working forests for carbon and sustainable timber production. And that program grew to about 22,000 acres. And just
It is sounding a little bit fuzzy still. Do you think you're able to call in, or do you have a different Wi-Fi connection?
I can try dialing in on the phone.
Okay, well, while you're doing that, why don't we go to Andrew just with a couple of questions? Would that be okay with you, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So you were mentioning that you were selected, the Blue Bonds for Ocean Conservation initiative was selected by TED for the Audacious project, which is a huge, huge win. Can you talk about the impact of being selected for that and sort of maybe what the ramifications were for you guys?
Sure. So for a little bit of a story, folks may be familiar with the work that we've done in the Seychelles. This is the first debt or debt conversion for marine protection that TNC did, and one of the first deals that NatureVest worked on. And essentially what we did is we repurchased about $20 million of the Seychelles government sovereign debt and restructured it so that they then owed that money to an entity that TNC created. And the savings that we were able to create on interest rates enabled us to have a cash flow going to conservation activity specifically. So it's like if you were to refinance your house and use the savings to get solar panels, for example. So that was so successful, and they just this year announced that they completed setting aside 30% of their marine protected area, 30% of their ocean area as marine protected areas. And they were well on their way last year when we were approached by the TED Audacious Prize. And we applied for that and went and spoke. And what it did was it generated ultimately $40 million worth of philanthropic support. And that's helping us build a team and add specialists to our team in conservation trust funds, in the debt negotiations, in science that's needed. And we can take that experience in this broader team and replicate that Seychelles experience over and over again. And we're targeting 20 different countries, or up to 20 different countries. We don't know what the final number will be, but we're targeting a total of $1.6 billion over 20 years that will go to these countries' conservation efforts specifically by doing deals like this.
That is really incredible. What a great idea, and just awesome to be connected to that that TED community, which is so philanthropic and generous and just loves those big audacious ideas. Andrew, you also, NatureVest started with an audacious goal to source and utilize $1 billion of capital investment for conservation by 2020, and it sounds like you guys just recently succeeded and hit that mark. Do you have any reflections on that? It's such a big accomplishment.
One thing is it took a long time to get there. If you look at the sort of chart of our progress, we had a number of deals right off the bat, 2014 to 2016. And I think that totaled somewhere around $200 million worth of capital committed to these things. And then we sort of hit a little bit of a plateau. And I think that's because we had built up a pipeline of deals, and we had executed them, and they were in different areas. And there's a lot of momentum there. But as we started to seek more scale, we were finding from impact investors that they weren't quite ready to take the risks of these novel deal structures, and they sort of had a disconnect between the returns they were expecting and the impact that they wanted to have. And that's starting that is in the past couple of years started to wash out a little bit, and that enabled us to sort of get to that goal, which we hit early this year. But the lesson learned is that we learned several lessons about working with investors and kind of how to target the types of deals that they're most interested in.
That's so great. And, I know that Tom is back on with his audio now, and I see that we don't have visuals. So we are just running into a few technical problems today, but please bear with us. Oh, here we go. So Tom, could you tell us what's going on here? This map?
Yeah, do you guys hear me now? Is this Liz? Can you confirm that this is working now? Do you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Great. Well, so I was talking about the Clinch Valley program and how that scaled to 22,000 acres, and just the biodiversity value in a place like this is enough to care about the landscape. But TNC science teams have continued to consider new data and how we can be most efficient in deploying the limited resources we have for conservation. And the map you're seeing here is the result of some climate resiliency analysis and circuit theory concepts that was actually led by TNC scientist Mark Anderson, who some of you may know. He's based in our Massachusetts program or office in Boston. And this map shows the predicted migratory routes that mammals, birds, and amphibians will take to move to suitable habitat in the face of climate change. And what you see is there's a major migratory route through the central Appalachians. And this science drove home the need to think big and to double down on TNC's work in the region. And the green circle you see is right where the Cumberland Forest Project sits, sort of at the mouth of that funnel up the central Appalachians. And with the ability to demonstrate our experience managing forests from projects like the Clinch and the huge importance of this place, we were able to warrant sort of attracting significant resources to do a project like the Cumberland Project, and we launched that in 2019. This next map shows the two properties in dark green that we acquired in the Cumberland Forest Project. In total, the project covers 250,000 acres and connects to over 1 million acres of other protected areas. And we're really standing on the shoulders of that great work that TNC has done over the years. A great example of that is the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area, which is the purple in the lower left corner. That was a TNC-led protection project that was done over a decade ago. In order to pull all of this off, TNC needed more money than we could raise philanthropically. And we had the sustainable business model and prior experience executing from projects like the Clinch to take that different approach. And ultimately, we raised $130 million of equity and debt from 27 limited partners and debt from 2 big partners, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation in the state of Virginia, to pull a project like this off. But of course, it's one thing to spend the money. That's in some ways the easy part. That's the beginning. And the real work is executing on these conservation business models over time. And that's what we're doing now. And our business model is based on diversified sources of revenue that are aligned with our conservation mission. This includes things like forest carbon projects, sustainably managed timber, recreation, restoration. First, let's talk a little bit about carbon. Basically, all of the forested area on the Cumberland Forest Project is enrolled in the California Cap and Trade Carbon Offset Program as improved forest management projects. We believe the project will sequester approximately 5 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent over the next decade. And current carbon prices are $12 to $13 a ton and forecast to increase over time. The carbon market compensates the project and the fund for storing carbon in the forest, for not harvesting trees or harvesting fewer trees. And this changes the economics of forest management and supports our sustainable timber strategy. The carbon market makes it economic to grow older forests, which are underrepresented on the landscape and provide greater structural diversity, which really is just a way to say more habitats for wildlife in the forest. And when we do harvest, we follow Forest Stewardship Council certification, and we harvest less than annual growth across the forest so that we're continually increasing our carbon stocks over time. We also derive revenue from recreational leases and restoration opportunities. These properties sit right in the heart of the elk reintroduction zone across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. And that's really driving some new opportunities in an ecotourism economy in the region. On the restoration front, we're focused on opportunities like abandoned mine land restoration, making those areas ecologically and economically productive again. A critical part of our strategy is supporting people and communities around the Cumberland Forest properties. The counties where these properties are located are all ranked as distressed or at risk by the Appalachian Regional Commission. And they're going through a very challenging economic transition as they shift from extractive industries like coal mining, and those industries continue to decline. The Cumberland Forest Fund donates a portion of the revenue that we receive towards nature-based economic development, working with local NGO partners. We're focused on the recreational economy, restoration, and clean energy to help with the broader economic diversification and transition going on in the region. And that's really an exciting part of this work. We've just started to launch that program and look forward to more to come on that front. Last but not least, our strategy has a long-term protection component. The fund doesn't have the ability to own these properties forever. So we are working on securing long-term protection beyond the fund's life. This starts with the California carbon projects. Those projects require carbon stocks to be maintained for 100 years. Now, that's not forever, but it's a long time in most of our ability to look into the future. So we know that our work to increase the forest age and structure and complexity will persist beyond our ownership. But we want to go even further than that. We're primarily focused on conservation easements with state and federal partners, a strategy Andrew highlighted earlier that's been a sort of staple of TNC's work. These are agreements that can, limit subdivision or development, require high standards of forest management practices, and ensure that ongoing management does not conflict with TNC's goals related to forest health, habitat, and water quality. They do allow some economic activity to continue and keep property on the tax rolls. And that's also very important given the need for economic development in this region. And this map shows the first easement we executed as part of this project. It's on the Highlands property in Virginia. And the area you see in yellow there is part of the property. That's about 23,000 acres in the Clinch River watershed that we placed under a permanent easement at the time of acquisition. We did that through an interesting loan program with the state of Virginia using their Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund and using it for natural capital, investing in nature, protecting the watershed, which is a really interesting use of that program and has a lot of potential to expand. And they provided that loan because this watershed provides drinking water to local communities, and it's critical to new businesses in the area, like the Sugar Hill Brewery, for example, in St. Paul, Virginia, which is on the map just south of that yellow area. And we're working on similar protection strategies across the rest of the portfolio as we manage the property. In closing, our ultimate goal is to demonstrate that this strategy of climate-smart forestry delivers superior conservation outcomes and competitive financial returns, with an eye towards influencing the broader forestry sector across the U.S. and globally, and pushing them to adopt some of these strategies that we are demonstrating at scale with this project. So I'll wrap up there. Apologies for the technical issues, but I'll turn it back over to Liz for questions.
Wow, that was really terrific and informative. I know I learned a lot about what you all are doing. We're going to move now into the question and answer portion of the webinar. So please do put your questions for Andrew and Tom in the Q&A box. I already see a few coming. But before we get to the audience questions, Tom, you've worked on so many cool projects in your role. What's been your favorite to date and why?
Well, that's a great question. I want to say the Cumberland project just because I'm living and breathing it every day, but I feel like I just talked about that one. You know, another project that was really exciting to me was some work that we did in the Pacific Northwest in the Olympic rainforest. We worked with our Washington chapter to help facilitate a couple transactions protecting the forest lands between the Olympic National Park and the Olympic National Forest down to the coast of the Olympic Peninsula. And those are areas where there are some of the best native salmon runs in the lower 48 states. And those forests are just so huge and majestic and really a fascinating place with a lot of issues similar to Cumberland, a lot of Native American partners and folks there that have helped us. And that has been a really interesting project to work on over the years.
That's really great. Wonderful. Andrew, just one other question. I know NatureVest, isn't for the average investor, but, how can people get involved with this, with your program?
Sure. Yeah, to clarify the investor, and I did mention that the way that we structure these investments, we have to only solicit investments from accredited investors. And as a matter of, I guess, efficiency, because we have a relatively small team and we're trying to get these deals done as quickly as we can, we do, I think historically, our minimum investment amount has been $1 million per investor. So that allows us to focus on a fewer number of investors to fulfill a deal. So that's typically how it's done. To get involved, there's a couple things from a philanthropic standpoint. Keeping in mind, all of our work is, as Tom demonstrated, in partnership with TNC chapters all over the world. So supporting those chapters and their efforts to build out programs like this is hugely helpful because they're 50% or more of the team whenever we do these. And another way I'd ask for everyone's support is just to sort of keep tabs on what's happening with ESG investment in general and how that impacts conservation, and talk about it, because it is, and especially this year, we have a really renewed focus on sustainability, knowing how our world is very fragile. And I think there's a big emphasis on how we can get ahead of that, and a big part of that is making investment decisions.
Thanks, Andrew. And we have a related question from John. With ESG investing getting so much more attention recently, are you finding more capital interested in your deals?
I would say I'll give a general answer. I don't know if Tom has any specific comments from his point of view. I think what's interesting is impact investing has been a very popular topic, and there's been a lot of, and we have to be careful which words we use, but commitments, and meaning commitment, saying large investors say, we are going to put this much money toward ESG investments. And sort of the early 2010s, those commitments were big, but the actual deployment of capital was not making it. We're seeing that start to shift. And what's most important is the deployment of capital, that people are actually signing up and making investments. So we are seeing more interest there. But we have a bucket of deals that we work on for TNC that are very specific. So luckily, we've always had strong interest in those.
Yeah, and I would agree with Andrew's perspective on that. I do think the interest is growing. Initially, it was a lot of talk, like Andrew said. We're starting to see more walk, people actually making investments. I see more activity to start in the foundations, the family offices, and the high net worth individuals. The banks are talking about it a lot. they're, I think, a little more focused on green bonds and some of those opportunities. And I think they're doing a little bit less in the more like private equity type or venture capital type investments, very early stage opportunities. But I do think it's growing. And I think as the market matures, more and more opportunities will be able to meet the requirements of banks for things like green bonds. And that, democratizes this more. It gets a broader distribution network. It brings down the minimums and it allows more people to access this through things like a 401k or retirement account, those types of things that I think will, help drive this to a broader slice of the investment universe.
Excellent. Sabine is asking a really great question. How do you choose where to invest? Do you guys have a decision-making framework for, all of the limitless possibilities that you probably encounter?
I can say a little bit about that. A lot of it starts with TNC's shared conservation agenda and where our priorities are. And so all of the work that we do, as part of the Nature Conservancy, we want it to be aligned with the shared conservation agenda. And, the example of the Cumberland Forest Project I gave kind of walked through a little bit of that in the beginning, right? We're looking at some of the things that have been really important to TNC for a long time. Where is there high biodiversity? Looking at some of this newer science about climate resiliency, projected migrations in the face of climate change, trying to be strategic about where we make an investment. So, you could do carbon forest projects anywhere that there are forests, right? But all those forests are not created equally in terms of the conservation impact they can have. And so, some of that fundamental science work is really important to that targeting that we do, to make sure that, if we're going to go through the time and effort and expense to do something like this, we want to make sure it really is impactful. And so, really grounding it in the science work, working with our local state and country partners is really important to determine where we want to invest within a strategy. So that's kind of the science conservation underpinning. On the financial side, we have to do a lot of analysis to make sure that we think it's viable on that front. And I always say, conservation is hard. Investing is hard. Doing conservation and investing is really hard. You have to, you're not clearing one hurdle, you're clearing two. So that's difficult. But, I think one of the things I think is really exciting is when we find these opportunities where there's a business model around our conservation work, scaling it with private capital is, I think, a great thing to do because it frees up our limited philanthropic resources to use on other new, unproven, exciting problems, right? That's what TNC does. We go out and we solve these problems and figure out solutions to conservation issues. And a lot of them are market failures. And that's where we really need to put our philanthropic resources. And when we can scale it with private capital, we should. And that's sort of an efficient way, I think, to use our resources.
Thanks, Tom. Andrew, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a perfect example.
Okay, I have a question. This is probably going to be one of those ones that you say no to, that you can't answer, but what kind of returns are your investors getting? I mean, people are obviously investing to make money as well as help nature, but can you talk a little bit about how it benefits, both nature and the investor?
So we'll answer and Tom, you can answer. The very vague answer is that, all these deals that we have, these 11 deals, very few of them look exactly the same. So there's no one answer, but I think Cumberland Forest might be a good recent example to give a careful answer. Nudge, nudge.
Yeah, well, what I'll say is, like Andrew said, a lot of our investments have different forms. So, in our blue bonds work, the investments are essentially bonds. And so we're trying to deliver returns that are competitive with other similar bonds, for example, right? So those are probably going to be lower return relative to some other opportunities. If we have an investment that's joint venture startup company, almost like a venture capital type investment, given that type of risk profile, we might expect some higher returns to, be competitive on a risk-adjusted basis. In the case of the Cumberland Forest Project, it's similar. We bought and we own timberland, and so we're trying to be competitive with the returns for an asset class like that, U.S. timberland. And if you look at, historic returns on U.S. timberland, they're in the mid-single digits. And so, we want to show that, we can deliver returns that are competitive with other strategies, but have better conservation outcomes. And so the answer is it depends kind of on that approach and the level of risk, right? If higher risk, we need to deliver higher returns to convince investors to take the plunge with us. And if it's lower risk, then we can have lower returns.
That was a great explanation. Thanks for answering that question, guys. So Nelda was wondering, she joined a little late and heard that $8 million in impact and $800 million, dollar impact investment stat that you had talked about. Is that, how many different partners and investors is that over?
So that is mostly reflected in a partnership that we have with an investment management firm in the agriculture space. So a place where we're limited in kind of what detail we can provide. So can't answer the question exactly how asked. But that's an example of institutional investment, meaning the biggest investors. And that's a situation where TNC is a partner in providing technical expertise in and for investment activities. So identifying conservation opportunities up front, and then helping to manage conservation impacts if a deal goes forward. So that is, that's a little bit of a watershed moment for us, because that proves that what we can do tying TNC science to investment strategies is appealing to the biggest investors and the biggest sources of capital. And so I think that's a really important point where I hope that area of our work will really expand quite quickly.
Tom, anything to add there?
No, I think Andrew covered it really well.
All right, well, let's jump into the next one. There's a lot of good questions here. I hope we can get to most of them. The next one from Allison is about community benefits. She thinks that a lot of the work that you're doing is really dependent on engagement with the community. So how do you guys spark that local engagement to make sure that the deals that you've developed are working at the local level?
I can say a little about that. I mentioned this community fund that we're doing as part of the Cumberland Forest Project, and that's part of it, right? We think that local communities need to benefit from these projects, whether that's jobs that are created in the conservation management or other investments in these communities. But even before that, I think it starts with just that on-the-ground presence, and that's something I think is very unique to the Nature Conservancy. As we approach impact investing, there are a lot of investment managers out in the world. There are very few of them that have an office or multiple offices in every state in the United States, right? TNC has that, and we have people that live in these communities that have been there for a long time, that have those local relationships, and really have that strong connection to place and community. And that's, I think, really powerful. And our Clinch program that's been there for 30 years, our prior work on things like the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area in the context of the Cumberland Project, working with these communities around recreation and restoration for a long time, I think that builds a lot of trust, and it shows that, we're really there for the long haul. So I think there's no replacement for that type of local engagement. So I think that's a big part of it, and involving them in the process, right? Understanding what they want, finding ways to have these projects benefit both people and nature, and finding that common ground. And the investments that we're going to make in the community fund, that's really geared towards that. We don't know what the best things are. And so, we're working with local nonprofit partners that know the local landscape much better than we do, to help get that money on the ground to support this type of nature-based economic development.
Anything to add, Andrew? Or
I mean, I'll just reiterate, the importance of having local partners both inside and outside TNC. Even the biggest conservation challenges, like climate change or ocean health, right? Things without borders. The most impact that we can have is at a very local level, right? That's where you see the results. So that's the underpinning of all the deals that we work on, is what that local impact is going to be and what we can help provide.
excellent. So we have a lot of questions that are asking about specific projects. So I'm going to just throw a few topics out there. And could you say what NatureVest is doing in these areas if it's not super top secret?
The lightning round. Okay.
The lightning round. So people want to know what you guys are doing in the coastal resilience space, aquaculture, the Amazon rainforest, and agriculture. Are there any things that you could tell us about in those spaces?
Let me try to do a quick list. If I think there was 4 in there. There's a lot of stuff always under development, right? We're always trying to figure out what can work. So agriculture is a great one. There's definitely a lot of work that can be done. Agriculture investment is a thing that exists, right? So it's just trying to figure out how can we make a compelling investment case with great conservation outcomes for, say, conversion of farms to organic practices or sustainable practices, and get good benefits to soil health and to water quality in those areas. So that is definitely a thing. Aquaculture is another one where we need to feed a lot of people in this world, and this world is growing, and fisheries are going to represent a huge growth area in protein. So that is definitely something that there's a lot of activity. Amazon rainforest, Tom, is there anything cooking there?
Yeah, there's one interesting project that we're involved in, which is working with our Brazil program, who's had a cocoa agroforestry program, working with small farmers to help them adopt cocoa agroforestry, which improves the economics on their farm and makes them more sustainable in the long term and reduces their need to clear new areas to provide cattle pasture. And it's not just about the deforestation. When you do cocoa agroforestry, a lot of carbon is actually stored in the cocoa trees. And so we're working with them to see if we can help scale that work to both address deforestation and sort of as a reforestation strategy, introducing trees into the landscape more, restoring some areas to both draw carbon out of the air and protect places like the Amazon that, of course, are huge stores of forest carbon.
I think you hit them all, except for coastal resilience. Is there anything happening in that space?
Coastal resilience, that's a good question. I know that there's definitely, when it comes to stormwater management, that is a key area. And I think I mentioned the JV that we are part of with a technology company that is retrofitting stormwater retention ponds in Maryland. And the idea there is to reduce the amount of pollutants that get washed into the Chesapeake Bay. So that's sort of a technology approach there. And there's some other examples of stormwater management in DC, which we've closed a deal in other cities where other TNC teams are working on it.
That's great. We had Steph Weir on a couple of weeks ago, and I think we all got an education in the big problem that sewage is in our coastal waters. So thank you for tackling that. We know that's a big one. Let's see, I think we have time to get to a few more. Renee is asking what the dream investment deal would be if you guys could imagine that. What would you want to put together?
I get the cheater's answer. In my seat in communications, every deal is kind of a dream deal, right? Because there's so many different things that we do, and it's so when we do a new type of deal or a bigger, better deal in some area where we have expertise and track record, it's so gratifying to get the response that we get from our supporters and from the public, and it really sort of builds excitement, and that makes my day. So anything's good for me. Yeah, to be honest.
Tom?
I think that the dream deal for us is one that really takes the experience and expertise of TNC and leverages it. That's where I think we have the best value to add, and where we can really change the market. So I like those deals where we get to draw on some of the innovations from our scientists and from the field, take some of these new ideas that they've pioneered and scale them up. That's what I think is really exciting. And then of course, low risk, high returns are always nice too, when you can find those.
Of course. I just realized I promised Annalise that I would ask this question at the top, and I totally missed it. So Annalise says she's just starting to educate herself on the resurfacing Green New Deal. So her knowledge is somewhat vague, but she's wondering if TNC supports this, if NatureVest supports this, and what the long range outcome could be. That's something anyone could tackle?
Well, I wouldn't be able to talk about it from a policy standpoint. We have a lot of folks who would be really well positioned to tackle it. But from our perspective, I would say it's indicative of the interest that we've been talking about in sustainable practices, and this cuts across business opportunities, economies, how different local populations are affected, and especially when they're affected disproportionately because of income or race. So all of that attention is only good for the greater mission of figuring out how we can tackle these problems in new and different ways. So it is very promising that these conversations are happening, and that people are really thinking about what are the decisions that we can make today that will prevent the worst of the worst tomorrow. And I think the pandemic that we're living with right now is just showing us it's like a very short and hard example of, say, climate change, which is much longer and harder to understand and wrap your head around. So I think there's a lot of benefit in these conversations bubbling up across the spectrum.
Tom, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, I agree with Andrew that it's positive, the greater attention on this stuff.
Great. Well, we are nearing the end of the webinar, so I just wanted to open this up to you both and say, are there any questions that we didn't ask you that you wanted to get into? Anything we should have talked about that we didn't talk about? Now's your chance. Where can people learn more about NatureVest?
Well, obviously the website. But we expect to have news coming out, on a steady basis, not a weekly basis. These things take time to develop, but we do hope that people pay attention to the great news that comes out. Like I'll mention just the other month, Tom's Cumberland Forest Project won the coveted Impact Investment of the Year, or Impact Fund of the Year award from a financial publication. So it's that kind of excitement that we see out there, and that we hope people will share in.
Great, that's very impressive. Good work, Tom. Tom, any final remarks?
No, I would just say thank you, Liz, for organizing, and thank you everyone for dialing in to hear a little bit about our work. It's great to have an opportunity like this to talk to folks. I really appreciate it.
Same here, agreed.
Well, thank you both so much for joining. And then also thanks to everyone who hung in through our technical difficulties and for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is really what makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to things that we talked about today and a recording of the webinar. You can also find the full webinar schedule and past recordings at nature.org/MA webinars. If you're enjoying these webinars, please share them with your friends. The more the merrier. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect. We're taking the next couple of weeks off of webinars, but we'll be back in September with more. And later today, and I think in the chat, you're going to receive a survey from us that we would really appreciate if you filled out. This survey is designed to help us make the webinars better and more catered to your interests. So please do fill that out. And as always, go to nature.org/MA webinars for our full schedule and for registering. So thank you again so much for joining and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks.
Bye, guys.